The Mafia boss was sent to kill her, but what he found in her crib changed everything. Before the rain-drenched nursery in Paris, there was the sun-bleached concrete of Milan. In the shadow of the Duomo, Nikolai Varelli had earned a name that made seasoned capos lower their voices: the butcher. At 38, he was the finished product of a brutal assembly line, a man whose Italian-Russian heritage had gifted him a dual sense of operatic drama and Siberian coldness. He didn't just kill. He erased. He operated with a strategic mind that viewed the European underworld as a grand chessboard, where human lives were merely pawns to be sacrificed for the stability of the Varelli Empire. The scar across his right eyebrow was a relic from those early years, a jagged souvenir from a night he had cornered 3 rival enforcers in a meatpacking district. He had walked out of that freezer alone, his tailored suit ruined by more than just condensation. Since then, Nikolai had traded the blade for the silent efficiency of the high-caliber suppressed pistol, and his heart for a vault of iron. He believed sentiment was a luxury for the dead. He lived by a singular, hollow truth: a weapon does not ask why, it only strikes. 3 days before he found himself standing over a white crib, Nikolai sat in a dimly lit boardroom in Rome, the air thick with the scent of espresso and expensive tobacco. His employer, a high-ranking member of the syndicate known only as the Cardinal, had slid a dossier across the polished mahogany. The face staring back at Nikolai was Noemi Lawrence. In the grainy surveillance photo, she looked haunted, her dark brown hair windswept as she hurried down a Parisian street. "She is a thief, Nikolai," the Cardinal had whispered, his voice like dry parchment. "She has stolen encrypted ledgers that could dismantle our shipping routes. She is selling them to the highest bidder in the East. She is a parasite, a threat to everything we have built. You are to go to her apartment, recover the drive, and ensure she never speaks again. No witnesses. No traces." Nikolai had studied Noemi's hazel eyes in the photo, looking for the glint of greed he saw in every other traitor. He found only a quiet, weary resilience, but he dismissed it. He was a professional, and his strategic mind already began mapping the entry points of her third-floor flat. He didn't see a woman, he saw a task. He didn't know that the encrypted ledgers were actually evidence of the syndicate's human trafficking wing, or that Noemi was a whistleblower whose only crime was a conscience. He was told she was a monster, and as he stood on that Parisian balcony 72 hours later, the butcher of Milan prepared to do what he did best. He reached for the doorframe with a gloved hand, unaware that the lie he had been fed was about to collide with a truth that would shatter his world. The metallic click of the safety being engaged echoed in the small nursery, a sound sharper than the thunder rolling over the Seine. Nikolai stood frozen, his thumb still captured by the infant's tiny, trusting grip. The weight of the suppressed pistol in his other hand felt suddenly, inexplicably wrong. "I don't have the ledgers, Nikolai," Noemi's voice broke the silence, a fragile thread of sound from the doorway. She hadn't run. She stood silhouetted by the hall light, her hazel eyes glistening with a terrifying clarity. "Because there are no ledgers. There is only a list." Nikolai didn't turn his head, his gaze still fixed on the child. "The Cardinal said you were a thief. He said you were selling our routes to the East." "I was a translator for their shipping department," she countered, taking a trembling step into the room. Her hands were raised, not in surrender, but as if to catch the tension before it snapped. "I saw the manifests, Nikolai. They weren't moving cargo. They were moving people. Girls no older than 16, sold into shadows from which they'll never emerge. I didn't steal money. I stole the names of the victims and the men who signed for them." Nikolai's jaw tightened. The strategic mind he prized began to re-evaluate the Rome briefing with cold, clinical speed. The syndicate didn't send a man of his stature to recover money, they sent him to bury a conscience. If Noemi had a list of names, she wasn't a rival, she was a mirror, reflecting the true ugliness of the empire he had spent 15 years defending. "The drive is hidden in the lining of the crib," she whispered, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "Kill me if you must. Do your job." But please. The list has to get to the authorities. Don't let my daughter grow up in a world where men like the Cardinal can buy and sell souls with a signature. Nikolai looked down at the child again. The baby had fallen back into a light sleep, her hand slipping away from his glove. For the first time in his life, the butcher of Milan felt the iron vault in his chest crack. He saw the understated beauty of Noemi's courage. A woman who had nothing but her resilience standing against a titan of the underworld. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the headlights of a black sedan swept across the rain-streaked window. The cleaners had arrived early to verify the kill. Nikolai realized then that he wasn't just holding a gun, he was holding the last shred of his own humanity. Pick up the child, Nikolai commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated with a new, dangerous purpose. And get away from the window. We have less than 60 seconds before this apartment becomes a graveyard. The heavy thud of a car door closing echoed from the street below, followed by the rhythmic splash of footsteps on wet pavement. The cleaners were professionals, men Nikolai had trained himself. They wouldn't come upstairs to help, they would come only to witness the cooling bodies and scrub the room of DNA. Do exactly as I say, Nikolai hissed, his steel-gray eyes snapping to the door. He grabbed a pillow from a nearby armchair and shoved it against the plaster wall furthest from the crib. Noemi lunged for her daughter, tucking the infant against her chest with a fierce, trembling desperation. She watched, paralyzed, as the man who had been sent to end her life suddenly became a whirlwind of calculated motion. Nikolai pulled his secondary weapon, an unregistered piece, and handed Noemi a heavy wool blanket. Get in the bathtub. Cover her. Cover yourselves completely, he ordered. When she hesitated, his voice dropped to a command that brooked no argument. Now. If they hear a muffled scream, it has to sound real. When I fire, you scream like the world is ending. Then, silence. Total silence. As Noemi scrambled into the porcelain tub, curling her body into a protective shell around the baby, Nikolai stood in the center of the living room. He could hear the faint jingle of keys at the front door. The cleaners had the master pass. Puff. 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 The suppressed shots were soft, like the clapping of hands, as Nikolai emptied 3 rounds into the sofa and 2 more into the pillow-muffled wall. Now, he barked. Noemi let out a jagged, blood-curdling shriek that tore through the apartment, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief that even made Nikolai's pulse hammer. He followed it with the heavy thud of a chair being overturned, simulating the final struggle of a body hitting the floor. He moved to the door just as the handle began to turn. Slipping into the shadows of the hallway, he cracked the door just an inch, letting the scent of cordite and the sight of an overturned room greet the 2 men in yellow rain slickers. It's done, Nikolai rasped through the gap, his voice dripping with his usual icy boredom. She's in the bedroom. Messy. I don't want to look at it anymore. Get in, take the pictures for the Cardinal, and burn the place. I'll meet you at the extraction point. The cleaners nodded, intimidated by his dark aura. As they stepped into the foyer, Nikolai didn't head for the exit. He waited until their backs were turned, their cameras clicking over the blood, spilled red wine from the kitchen counter, and slipped back into the bathroom. He reached down, his leather-gloved hand finding Noemi's shoulder. She flinched, but when she looked up, she saw not the butcher of Milan, but a man who had just committed treason for a stranger. We have 3 minutes before they light the fuse, he whispered, hauling her up. The fire escape is our only way out. From this moment on, Nikolai Varelli is dead. And so are you. The iron rungs of the fire escape groaned under Nikolai's weight as he descended into the labyrinth of the Parisian night. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, a freezing curtain that blurred the world into gray and black. Behind him, Noemi clung to the child, her breath hitching with every slick step. Nikolai didn't look back, he focused on the street-level shadows, his broad shoulders acting as a literal breakwater against the wind and the rain, creating a small, dry pocket for the mother and child. They reached the alleyway just as an orange glow flickered in the third-story window. The cleaners had set the charges. A dull thump vibrated through the air, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Nikolai didn't flinch. He grabbed Noemi's arm, pulling her close to his side, his large frame shielding her from the view of any passing patrol cars. "The subway," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "If we take a car, they'll track the plates. We need the crowds. We need to become ghosts." They descended into the Châtelet station, a sprawling underground hive of concrete and fluorescent light. The air here was thick with the scent of damp wool and electricity. Nikolai moved with a predator's grace, his dark suit soaked through, his eyes scanning the commuters like a radar. He positioned himself behind Noemi as they moved through the turnstiles, his massive build creating a physical barrier between her and the world. To any onlooker, they were just a family caught in the rain, but to Nikolai, every man in a trench coat was a potential assassin. As a train roared into the station, the screech of metal on metal filled the tunnel. Nikolai stepped onto the crowded car first, carving out a corner seat with a single, icy stare that sent a group of teenagers scurrying. He stood over Noemi and the baby, his hands gripping the overhead rails like iron bars, his body a human shield against the swaying of the train and the prying eyes of the public. Noemi looked up at him, her hazel eyes reflecting the flickering subway lights. The baby had finally fallen asleep, lulled by the rhythmic vibration of the tracks. For a moment, the terror of the burning apartment felt miles away. She saw the tension in Nikolai's jaw, the way his steel-gray eyes never stopped moving. He was a man who had spent his life dealing in death, yet here he was, using his formidable strength to hold back the entire world for her. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice lost to most, but caught by his sharp ears. Nikolai didn't look down. "To a place where the syndicate doesn't have eyes," he replied, his voice a low vibration in his chest. "But first, we have to survive the next 10 stops. Stay small, Noemi. The hunt hasn't even begun." The safe house was a cramped, forgotten studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, smelling of dust and stale winter air. For Nikolai, it was a tactical bunker, for Noemi, it was a temporary sanctuary. But for the infant, it was simply a place where she was hungry and cold. As the adrenaline of the escape faded, reality set in with a piercing, high-pitched wail. The baby's cries bounced off the bare walls, a sound more unnerving to Nikolai than the whistle of a ricocheting bullet. He stood in the center of the room, his dark suit still damp, looking down at the small bundle in Noemi's arms with genuine bewilderment. "She needs to eat," Noemi whispered, her face pale with exhaustion. "And she's freezing. I need warm water for her bottle, Nikolai." The butcher of Milan, a man who could strip and reassemble a sniper rifle in total darkness, stared at the small stove as if it were an alien technology. He moved with stiff, awkward precision, his large hands looking absurdly out of place as he fumbled with a small pot of water. He checked the temperature of the milk against his wrist, his steel-gray eyes narrowing in concentration. He was calculating the optimal heat with the same intensity he used to calculate a hit's trajectory. When the bottle was ready, he handed it to Noemi, but his task wasn't over. Noemi's hands were shaking so violently from the night's trauma that she could barely hold the child. "Give her to me," Nikolai rasped. It wasn't a request, it was a tactical intervention. He sat on the edge of the sagging bed, his 6 feet 3 inches frame dwarfing the furniture. He took the infant, cradling her against his broad chest. To his shock, the baby didn't recoil from the scent of leather and rain. Instead, she quieted, her small face turning toward the warmth of his body. Nikolai held the bottle with a delicacy that felt like a betrayal of his nature. His massive, scarred thumb brushed against her velvet-soft cheek, and for a fleeting second, the butcher vanished. Noemi watched him from the shadows of the room, her hazel eyes softening. She saw the way his powerful shoulders dropped an inch, the way his intimidating presence seemed to shrink to accommodate the tiny life in his arms. "You're good with her," she murmured. Nikolai didn't look up, but the muscle in his jaw worked. "A weapon is only as good as its grip," he replied, falling back on his cold metaphors to hide the fact that his heart was beating with a rhythm he hadn't felt in decades. "She's just another responsibility." But as the baby gripped his pinky finger and drifted back to sleep, Nikolai knew he was lying. The iron vault in his chest hadn't just cracked. It was being dismantled by a creature who didn't know his name or his sins. He wasn't just a protector anymore, he was a man rediscovering what it meant to be human. The storm outside had settled into a rhythmic tapping against the safe house window, a stark contrast to the heavy silence within. Nikolai sat by the door, his dark suit jacket discarded, revealing the white dress shirt stretched tight across his shoulders. He was cleaning his secondary weapon with a piece of cloth, his movements mechanical, until he felt Noemi's gaze. She was sitting on the floor by the radiator, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the light catch the jagged line of the scar over his right eye. "How did you get it?" she asked softly. "The one on your brow. It doesn't look like the others." Nikolai's hand paused. Usually, he would have silenced such a question with a look that could freeze blood. But tonight, the air was different. The scent of baby powder still clung to his leather gloves, and the vulnerability in Noemi's hazel eyes acted as a key to a door he had kept triple-locked for 20 years. "I wasn't always a weapon, Noemi," he began, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. He set the gun down and leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the peeling ceiling. "In Milan, I had a brother. Mikhail. He was the one with the talent, the one who was supposed to take over the family business. I was just the shadow that followed him." He reached up, his thumb tracing the ridge of the scar. "The syndicate didn't like our father's terms. They sent a message. Not a letter, but a night of fire. I was 18. I tried to pull Mikhail from the wreckage of our home, but the beams were too heavy. A piece of glass caught me as the second floor collapsed. I watched him go, and I realized that in this world, being a shadow wasn't enough. You had to be the monster in the dark, or you would be the one burning in it." Noemi listened, her breath held. She saw the strategic mind of the Mafia boss fall away, revealing a boy who had been forged in grief. "The cardinal found me in the ashes," Nikolai continued, his steel-gray eyes dark with old smoke. "He gave me a choice, die as a victim or live as his blade. I chose the blade. I thought that by becoming the butcher, I could protect the things I cared about. But the irony of this life is that the more power you gain, the less you have left to love. You trade your soul for a seat at a table where everyone is a ghost." He looked at her then, the moonlight catching the silver in his eyes. "I saw that same fire in your apartment tonight. And for the first time in 2 decades, I didn't want to be the one who started it. I wanted to be the one who stopped it." Noemi reached out, her hand hovering near his arm before she gently pulled back. "You're not a ghost, Nikolai. Not tonight." "Maybe," he rasped, turning back to his weapon. "But the syndicate doesn't believe in resurrection. They only believe in burials." The blue glow of a burner phone illuminated Nikolai's face, casting deep shadows across the room as he scrolled through the encrypted underworld network. The silence of the safe house was shattered by a sudden, rhythmic vibration from the device. A message appeared, glowing like a radioactive ember. Status, red. Varelli, N, target acquired. The syndicate had found the wine on the floor. They had found the lack of a body in the ashes of the apartment. The cleaners had reported back, and the cardinal had wasted no time. "Pack everything," Nikolai rasped, his voice cutting through the quiet. He stood up, his broad shoulders blocking the dim light of the single lamp. The fake execution was bought for a few hours. Now, they've opened the vaults. Noemi stood, clutching the child to her chest. "What does that mean?" Nikolai turned the phone screen toward her. A digital dossier of his own face stared back, marked with a staggering 8-figure sum. It wasn't just a hit, it was a global hunt. It means every street-level thug, every professional assassin, and every brother I've ever sat at a table with is currently looking for my head. I am no longer a boss. I am the most expensive piece of meat in Europe. The weight of his past was now a literal price tag. His strategic mind, once used to expand the syndicate's reach, was now being used to predict how they would hunt him. He knew the protocols because he had written half of them. They would start with his private accounts, then his known safe houses, and finally, they would move to the borders. We have to move before the first tier of hunters hits the city, he said, sliding into his dark suit jacket and checking the magazine of his pistol with a crisp, metallic snap. They won't come with a conversation. They'll come with a siege. Noemi looked at the child, then back at Nikolai. The man who had once been the butcher of Milan was now the only wall standing between her and a tide of professional killers. The bounty had turned the world into a minefield, yet Nikolai's steel-gray eyes remained focused, his fear buried under a layer of tactical ice. "Nikolai," she whispered, "they'll kill you for this." He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, his silhouette a mountain of dark resolve. Let them try. They're used to hunting people who are afraid to die. They've never hunted a man who finally has something worth living for. He stepped into the hallway, his leather-gloved hand guiding her into the shadows. The hunt was on, and the European night was no longer his ally, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. Nikolai stood by the heavy steel door of a secondary, fortified cellar, his silhouette a grim monolith against the dim light. He had left Noemi and the child with enough supplies for 48 hours and a burner phone with a single contact. He didn't want to leave them, but his strategic mind knew the truth: as long as his lieutenants breathed, they would act as bloodhounds for the syndicate. To save the woman and the child, he had to stop being a protector and return to being a predator. "Stay away from the vents," Nikolai commanded, his voice a low, iron rasp. "If the phone vibrates twice, leave through the tunnel. Don't wait for me." Noemi reached out, her fingers grazing his leather sleeve. "Nikolai, there are dozens of them. You can't fight an entire army." "I don't need to fight an army," Nikolai replied, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he pulled a black tactical mask over his face. "I just need to cut off the heads." The shadow war began in a rain-slicked shipyard on the outskirts of the city. His first target was Luca, a man he had mentored, now the first to lead a strike team to claim the bounty. Nikolai didn't use a gun, he used the environment. He moved through the shipping containers like a ghost, a 6 feet 3 inches specter of vengeance. One by one, Luca's men vanished into the darkness, silenced by the cold precision of a man who knew every one of their tactical weaknesses. When he finally stood before Luca, Nikolai didn't offer a plea for mercy. He simply showed him the face of the man the syndicate had betrayed. The butcher was back, but he wasn't killing for profit, he was killing for a future he wasn't sure he'd live to see. By midnight, the city's underworld was in a state of panic. Nikolai moved with surgical efficiency, striking at the heart of the syndicate's local operations. He hit the safe houses, the communication hubs, and the private clubs where his former peers felt most secure. In a high-end penthouse, he confronted his second lieutenant, Victor, who was halfway through a bottle of scotch while monitoring the bounty's digital tracker. "You should have stayed dead, Nikolai," Victor spat, reaching for a weapon. Nikolai was faster. He didn't just disarm him, he dismantled his resolve. "Tell the cardinal that the price on my head isn't high enough," Nikolai whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, quiet fury. "Tell him that every man he sends is just another body I'll use to pave the way for her escape." As the sun began to bleed over the Parisian horizon, Nikolai stood on a rooftop, his dark suit torn and stained with the night's work. He had taken out the primary hunters, leaving the syndicate's local infrastructure in ruins. He was exhausted, his body a map of fresh bruises and shallow cuts, but the clean house protocol was complete. He had bought them the only thing that mattered in their world, time. The morning mist clung to the valleys of the Haute-Savoie like a protective shroud as the battered sedan crested the final ridge. Below them lay a village of stone and slate, a place where time had slowed to a crawl and the reach of the syndicate was nothing more than a ghost story. Nikolai gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his white shirt stained with the soot and salt of the shadow war he had survived, but his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "This is it," Nikolai rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to echo the stillness of the mountains. "The priest here owes me a life. He has papers for you. A new name. A new history." Noemi looked out at the peaceful village, then back at Nikolai. The man beside her was no longer the butcher of Milan, he was a scarred sentinel who had burned down an entire world to keep her safe. "Come with us, Nikolai," she whispered, her hazel eyes pleading. "The war is over. You don't have to be a ghost anymore." Nikolai paused, his hand hovering near the door handle. He looked at the child, sleeping soundly in the back seat, oblivious to the blood that had been shed for her silence. He thought of the list Noemi carried. The list that was even now being decrypted by his few remaining allies to bring the syndicate to its knees. "If I stay, the fire follows," he said, the words heavy with a finality that broke Noemi's heart. "As long as I am a shadow, you can live in the light. That is the bargain I made with the dark." He helped her move her few belongings into a small, vine-covered cottage on the edge of the woods. He didn't linger. He didn't ask for a goodbye. He simply touched the infant's forehead one last time with a gloved finger, a silent blessing from a man who had forgotten how to pray. 6 months later, the village was vibrant with the colors of autumn. Noemi stood in the small garden behind her cottage, hanging laundry as her daughter, now a toddler beginning to find her footing, chased a butterfly through the tall grass. Noemi felt a sudden, familiar prickle on the back of her neck. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. High up on the tree line, hidden among the dense pines, a pair of steel-gray eyes watched through a lens. Nikolai sat motionless, his broad shoulders camouflaged by a dark tactical jacket. He saw Noemi's soft smile and the child's laughter. He saw the peace he had bought with his own exile. He was the ghost in the trees, the silent guardian who would spend the rest of his days ensuring that no shadow ever touched that garden again. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of pine and mountain air, a scent that had finally replaced the smell of gunpowder. He was alone, but for the first time in 38 years, he wasn't empty. The butcher was gone. In his place was a man who finally knew what it meant to love something more than he feared the dark.